Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I am Curt DiCamillo, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I have the honor to be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. But before I go any further, I have to say it is the most gorgeous day in Boston. It's supposed to be almost 70 degrees today. And as I sit here in my apartment in the Jamaica Plains section of our fair city, it is just streaming with gorgeous sunlight. I mean, it does give you hope just to have a bright day like this in this hideous world that we're living in at the moment. So a little bit about us. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical organization in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Castle Howard is truly one of England's finest country houses. Nestled in the Howardian hills of Yorkshire's idyllic countryside, the estate features more than 200 buildings and monuments, breathtaking architecture, astounding gardens, and has been the home of the Carlisle branch of the Howard family for more than 300 years. Today, the castle's curator, Dr. Christopher Ridgway, will trace the origins of this famous house during the early years of the 18th century and the ever-growing vision of the third Earl of Carlisle. Not content with a magnificent mansion, Lord Carlisle went on to fashion this corner of Yorkshire forever in his own image. He didn't have a lack of ego, creating a sublime landscape filled with monuments, lakes, woodlands, and gardens. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website. Christopher Ridgway has been the curator at Castle Howard since 1985. He's lectured on the house, its history, and collections around the world, and published extensively. Chris is the chair of the Yorkshire Country House Partnership, a collaborative research project among the houses of the region, and is an adjunct professor at the Center for the Study of Historic Houses and Estates at Maynooth University, part of the National University of Ireland. He also sits on the board of the Irish Heritage Trust, and in 2019 was awarded a UK Lifetime Achievement Award. He has many publications under his belt, but I would like to highlight two of the most recent. The first being Castle Howard and Brideshead, Fact, Fiction, and In Between. And that's a wonderful little booklet that I cannot recommend more highly enough because, as I'm sure you all know, Castle Howard was the scene for two filmings of Brideshead Revisited. The first, of course, the great 1981 miniseries by Granada Television, and the second, the less satisfactory movie version with the wonderful Emma Thompson. And just last year, he came out with New Walls for Old Pictures, Country House Collections, their past, present, and future. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful Dr. Ridgway.
Good, thank you very much indeed. And welcome to everybody from a gloriously sunny Yorkshire, although we can't quite boast the heady heights of 70 degrees. Now, imagine you're a tourist in Britain at the end of the 17th century. You're interested in buildings and landscapes. You travel around the country seeing examples of houses, old and new. One day, you find yourself in Yorkshire and learning about the great building operations that have been going on not far from the city of York. You make a journey to see the Earl of Carlisle's new home, Castle Howard. To begin with, you would have encountered the chaos of a building site. But gradually, as the house took shape, and by about 1710, you might encounter something like this, a private palace like no other in the land, something that astonished spectators, not only on account of its splendor and large dimensions, as reported by one contemporary, but because of its extraordinary appearance. Now, granted, the house was not strictly finished by this date, but if you were lucky, you might be shown an illustration of the intended design, a vast forecourt palace crowned by a gigantic dome and looking like a walled city from afar. Nothing you've seen en route to Yorkshire will have prepared you for such a sight. And hence the question, just where did this house come from? Today, we're so used to the appearance of Castle Howard that it's worth pursuing this inquiry, because the place did not spring entirely out of nowhere. Its design and creation can be traced in part through other buildings, as well as drawings and building account books, which trace virtually day by day the creation of the house. But at the same time, its appearance was new, stunning, and unprecedented. So let's begin in the year 1699, when Castle Howard was begun by Charles Howard, 3rd Earl of Carlisle, a Whig aristocrat and aspiring politician during the reign of King William and Mary. And at the time, the principal Howard family seat was Naworth Castle in Cumberland, close to the Scottish border. As you can see, this was a fortified medieval structure that had been partially converted to a more comfortable residence in the course of the 17th century. But as Carlisle's political influence began to extend beyond Cumberland, he spent more time in Yorkshire, integrating himself into Whig circles at court. And by the late 1690s, anticipating a promising career path, he decided to consolidate his position as a landowning grandee and improve his estates in Yorkshire. In 1698, he took out a lease for life from his mother on the castle and manor of Henderskelf. And from this date, he resolved to build a grand new house for himself. Short of purchasing new lands in the south of England, Henderskelf was an ideal location where Carlisle could establish a power base in the country. It was close to the important regional capital of York, a mere 15 miles away, and the city itself was about 3 to 4 days' journey from London, so he could remain in contact with the capital. Now, at this time, Henderskelf consisted of a castle, a village, and a church, all of which were to vanish with the building of Castle Howard. Now, Carlisle could have decided to remodel or improve the existing castle, but he didn't, discouraged probably by the fact that it had already been refurbished 10 years earlier, but then subsequently damaged by fire. And in this map of 1694 in the archives of Castle Howard, we can see the plan of the old castle, showing it as a rectangular block with 2 stumpy projecting wings and a little forecourt area aligned on an east-west axis. So, crucially, the decision was made not to remodel and improve, but to tear down and build anew. And this presents us with an opportunity to explore Carlisle's thinking for his new home. For at the planning stage, certain fundamentals persist. It doesn't matter if it was yesterday or today, whether you're rich or you're poor, amateur or professional, or whether one is building big or small. When it comes to early visions and initial thinking, everybody has to go down a similar path. And so we can begin to consider why Carlisle ended up building the way he did, as well as why he didn't build in other ways. Architecture and buildings begin with simple rules. They comprise straight lines and rely on basic geometric shapes, squares or rectangles, triangles, and from time to time circles or curved lines. A square or rectangle might be said to be the basic structural form. Triangles appear with gables and pediments, and circles with arches, domes, and towers. But it's less usual for a building to be defined by these shapes alone in terms of core structure. But of course, buildings utilizing these shapes were not unknown in England. Triangular houses are uncommon, but the most notable examples on the left of your screen is Sir Thomas Tresham's Triangular Lodge of 1594 at Rushton in Northamptonshire. And on the right of your screen, Midford Castle in Somerset, begun in 1775. Circular residences are equally rare, There's the Earl of Bristol's Great Rotunda at Ickworth in Suffolk, begun in 1795, and the smaller à la ronde in Devon, begun about the same time. Looking at Ickworth, I wonder to myself, with those curved interiors, how could he possibly hang paintings on those walls? But these forms were not entertained by Carlyle. In his own mind, he was considering a house that employed the square or rectangle as the principal structural unit. But within that square or rectangular matrix, enormous variety was possible, not just in terms of size and scale, but also in the combination of units, sequences of square or rectangular blocks joined together, or perhaps attached as wings or projecting wings, or forming H shapes, quadrangles, and enclosed courtyards. Now, in one sense, this is very, very basic stuff. We're talking literally about building blocks. But anyone who has the money and the will to build a new house will begin more or less in this fashion. However, these early abstract shapes would not have formed in Carlyle's mind without reference to real buildings he'd seen or heard about. And in design terms, numerous models might be drawn from a range of 17th century English aristocratic or gentry houses. Square, oblong, or double pile houses, such as Eltham Lodge, built by Hugh May in 1663, on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can see it comprises 7 bays by 4 bays on the side elevations. Or there's Winslow House in Buckinghamshire, built by Sir Christopher Wren, one of his very few country houses. And this comprises 7 by 7 bays. And Eltham is perhaps more horizontal in its emphasis, distinguished by a portico and pilasters at the front, whereas Wren's building is more vertical, rising 3 stories, and its height emphasized by the large chimney stacks. As for H-shaped buildings, such as Castlebury Park in Hertfordshire, remodeled at the end of the 17th century, although not quite as it appears in this engraving. But significantly, Castlebury was also the family home of Carlyle's wife, Lady Anne Capel, so he will have known that building intimately. As for examples of houses with side wings, well, they could include Sprotbrough Hall in Yorkshire, built in 1685, with 5 bays and then attached to a 7-bay centre, a long stretched building. Or on the bottom left of your screen, Althorp House, Northamptonshire, with its projecting wings, and this remodelled for the Earl of Sunderland in the 1680s. So in due course, during that sort of gestation period, Carlyle and his architects would start to incorporate elements from these designs into the form of Castle Howard. And then finally, there are houses arranged around inner courtyards, such as Euston Hall in Suffolk, remodelled for the Duke of Grafton in the late 1660s, to include, as we see in this contemporary painting, 4 domed corner pavilions. Now, these are just a handful of examples of the shape and form such houses might take, whether built new or remodelled. And many of Carlyle's contemporaries were embarking upon similar grandiose projects in the 1690s, following earlier waves of country house building in the previous decades. And these contemporary projects will also have influenced Carlyle's thinking. And he certainly knew a number of aristocratic mansions at first hand. For instance, Thoresby in Nottinghamshire, belonging to the Duke of Kingston from the 1680s, and Chatsworth, Derbyshire, home of the Duke of Devonshire, also remodelled in the 1680s. And these are both large block-like houses with central courts, grand facades with long fronts. But other contemporaries included the Duke of Montagu, who was engaged in 2 grand building projects, also in the 1680s. Boughton House in Northamptonshire on the top of your screen, but he was also at the same time modernising his London home, Montagu House in Bloomsbury. And then at the bottom of your screen, Petworth in Sussex, home of the Duke of Somerset, who was also improving the building at this time. And these houses are characterized by a long rectangular elevation for the central block and projecting wings. But it wasn't just the shape and the scale of these buildings that influenced Carlisle. It was, of course, also the fact that they were displays of power and wealth by leading aristocrats. They marked a new generation of courtier houses, built by some of the grandest men in the country, all of them dukes, of course. Now, Carlisle would have been free to adopt elements from any of these buildings and others if he so chose. But of course, he didn't design his house alone. He required an architect. And architects, like would-be house owners, are eclectic creatures too. They're magpies of the structural world. They'll always borrow, combine, recombine, and seek new and original designs, albeit within the disciplines of their profession. Namely, to guarantee that no matter how bizarre, huge, or original a structure is, it will, at the very least, stand up and hopefully be inhabitable. So to begin with, Carlisle chose William Talman as his architect. Now, Talman is a curious figure who's received a consistently bad press as arrogant, unpleasant, and grasping. But Talman was the premier country house architect in England, and he was therefore the obvious choice. And it's been estimated that between 1680 and 1715, he was involved in no less than 20 country houses. He'd remodeled the south front at Chatsworth, and among his other commissions were Uppark House in Sussex in the early 1690s for Lord Grey, and the east front at Dirham Park in Gloucestershire at the end of that century for William Blathwayt. So early in 1699, Talman submitted two proposals to Carlisle, and both show a large rectangular block-like building, and both were rejected. Now, Talman can't have been dismissed solely on account of his bad temper and a quarrel over his expenses. Something was unsatisfactory about these designs, but what exactly? As ideas for a Baroque mansion, these were ambitious plans on a par with what he'd built at Chatsworth or at Dirham. 13 bays in length, with apartments planned around a grand central hall and intricate arrangements for double staircases either side. And in the first plan on the top, marked by the asterisks, there is a rotunda and a matching octagon. And in the second at the bottom, you can see marked in blue, an oval saloon with a projecting bay. And they certainly betray a French influence and also correspond with designs Talman was working on for William III at Hampton Court. And there's no reason to doubt that their elevations would have looked every bit as spectacular as those at, say, Chatsworth or at Dirham. So why should Carlisle have declined them then? After all, he'd approached the most experienced, if not the most congenial, country house architect of the day, who numbered some of the most prestigious names in the land among his patrons, and who had supplied him with two perfectly respectable proposals. Well, the answer to this lies in a number of places. Talman was a difficult character, and probably Carlisle felt he'd prefer a more amicable relationship with the man who'd be responsible for his new house. And this would have been made all too apparent by his new friendship with a complete amateur who had a rich and colourful past. Thank you. And this was Sir John Vanbrugh. Now, Sir John Vanbrugh was, first of all, a failed East India Company merchant, a Marine who had been imprisoned in France, a successful playwright, and now, as career choice number 4, an aspiring architect. But significantly, he was also a member of the Kit Kat Club in London, where both men are likely to have passed many congenial evenings together, in circumstances not unlike the scene depicted in this painting, attributed to Hogarth and entitled A Club of Gentlemen. And indeed, it's likely that Vanbrugh's Castle Howard began life as a drawing on the back of a napkin, perhaps, and maybe similar to this little sketch on the bottom right of the screen by Vanbrugh for an unidentified house. So Vanbrugh's panache clearly inspired Carlyle, but he also astutely reassured his patron by bringing on board the highly experienced architect Nicholas Hawksmoor, who had worked with Wren. And so 3 men would be responsible for the early vision of Castle Howard. And at some stage, around 1699, 1700, Carlyle decided he wanted a mansion that was more than just a rectangular block. He desired a more complex shape, both in terms of ground plan and elevation. And this desire for a more sophisticated three-dimensionality to his new house resulted in Castle Howard. And by the summer of 1699, he must have settled on a building with projecting wings to form a large forecourt enclosure or cour d'honneur. And significantly, in the 1690s, a number of houses were built or remodeled which adopted this formula of projecting wings and a forecourt. And Carlyle probably knew of these. They included in the top left Lowther Castle, Westmoreland, rebuilt in the early 1690s and not that far from his family home in Cumbria, Naworth Castle. And then there's Kyton House in Yorkshire, home to the Duke of Leeds, begun in 1698. And finally, on the bottom left, Burley on the Hill in Rutland, home of the Earl of Nottingham, begun earlier in that decade. And importantly, these 2 last houses, Kyton and Burley, Vanbrugh is known to have visited in the summer of 1699 as he journeyed north to Yorkshire. And this sketch by him, although a little later in date, indicates what the 2 men were envisaging in terms of an entrance forecourt at least as grand as or grander than those of other contemporary houses. And often in houses with this sort of forecourt arrangement, the forward buildings might be pavilions or service wings, office blocks, or stables even, and not necessarily part of the dwelling proper. But at Castle Howard, the forward wings were integral to the living space, and they would be going to be linked with the main pile in a new and original manner. Now, I think this point is worth labouring precisely because we're so used to the finished shape of Castle Howard, we take its form for granted. It is an amazing structure to behold today, and even more so as it materialised in the 18th century. And looking at the volume and quality of country houses built in England during the 17th century, one realizes that in spite of a galaxy of hugely talented architects that included Inigo Jones, Hugh May, Christopher Wren, and William Talman, nothing quite prepares one for the form of Castle Howard. There's very little in the architecture of the 1680s and 1690s that seems to anticipate this extraordinary and original design. It seems really almost to come out of nowhere. And such, we might say, is the alchemy between an aspiring, wealthy aristocrat, a visionary amateur, and a skilled professional architect. These 3 figures who came together around this exuberant Baroque house. And in short, Carlyle wanted to build not just a house, but a palace. And this desire goes a long way to explaining the forecourt shape of the house and the presence of the crowning dome. Wherever one views the building, the eye is engaged by competing planes, masses, and blocks, both on a horizontal and vertical axis. And we shouldn't forget, too, that Vanbrugh favoured this kind of complex. 4 more of his great houses employ the forecourt formula, including Blenheim Palace on the top of your screen. The bottom right, you have Seaton Delafour in Northumberland, and bottom left, Grimsthorpe Castle in Lincolnshire. Now, architecturally, the shape of Castle Howard evolved through a number of stages and can be schematized with this diagram, showing the development of the house from a rather basic, uneven design to something more sophisticated and symmetrical and much, much larger. And these sketches record a growth in style, but also scale. Carlyle wanted to build big. And the first design in this sequence shows what is to be believed to have been another Talman proposal, as illustrated in a contemporary garden design for Castle Howard. Now, this is modelled on the earlier plan of Henderskelf. Very similar. We see a house with two roughly symmetrical wings and a central forecourt with possibly lodges at the front. And indeed, Talman's first proposal may have been nothing more than a remodelling of the old medieval Henderskelf castle, rather than a brand new building. And this house was placed on an east-west axis like the old castle. However, all subsequent designs repositioned the house to face north-south, as we know the house today. And that's a move traditionally credited to Vanbrugh. Now, the second plan illustrates a central square block with two forward and somewhat remote wings connected by what I call right-angled elbows. And this plan corresponds with a drawing in Hawksmoor's hand of about this time, 1702. And the elevation reveals a tall central block with a giant portico at the front and entablature, and surmounted by a rather slender cupola. And the projecting wings are awkwardly distant from the main block. They also have little lanterns or cupolas on top. And the third plan corresponds with what is known as the first proposal of about 1699. The central block has grown in length, and the projecting wings are now longer and are connected by two small curved links, or hinges as I like to call them. One can really hardly refer to them as proper quadrants yet. And this design, notice in the center of the drawing, does not yet include the dome, which had not figured in Vanbrug's thinking by this point. And then the fourth plan corresponds with what is known as the second or revised proposal of around 1700. And it still shows the house with a long garden front, but now the forward wings are firmly anchored to the main block with these substantial quadrants you see marked in red on the image on the top right. And these form connecting passageways with a full arc shape. The dome is also an integral part of the design. You can see it marked in the ground plan, and supporting corner piers have been added to the sides of the hall, which is now circular and rises into the lantern. And this plan that you see at the top corresponds with the elevation beneath it of the south front, also of about 1700, in Vanbrugh's hand, which illustrates that large central lantern and dome, and also quaintly has a plume of smoke coming out of one of the chimney stacks. And the three-dimensional power of this complex is apparent both from the famous bird's eye view that appeared in Vitruvius Britannicus in 1725 and a more recent model. But we have to remember that the building remained unfinished at the time of Vanbrugh's death in 1726, with the matching west wing and offices beyond unbuilt. And so the final sequence shows the house as intended to be built and how it looks today, with the addition of Sir Thomas Robinson's west wing, built in the 1750s to a different style. Now that is a little schematic run through of, if you like, the gestation of Castle Howard to the shape it is today. And Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor will certainly have fueled Carlisle's dreams with their knowledge of some of the grandest buildings in England, and especially the appeal of a great forecourt building with its palatial impact. And in one respect, Carlisle needed have looked no further than Versailles as the supreme model. Here was a palace complex with projecting wings and grand forecourt, not to mention lavish apartments and spectacular gardens, that was the focal point of Ancien Régime France. No matter that the absolutist court of Louis XIV was a cultural and political phenomenon that every Whig Englishman who championed liberty affected to despise, Versailles remained the exemplar, both as an architectural marvel and a seat of power. And although he hadn't visited Louis's palace in person, engravings were easily available. And given too that a little later in his life, Carlisle was to entertain fantasies of himself as something of a sun king in Yorkshire, we can be sure that he was aware of Versailles. Now, in comparison, the royal palaces of England were something of a mixed bunch. Whitehall in London remained a confused conglomeration of older buildings, as you can see from this sketch here. Other royal castles, such as Windsor Castle, had been partially remodeled after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, and certainly Hampton Court and Kensington Palace were being grandly refurbished in the 1690s for William III. But perhaps the most intriguing royal palace of the late 17th century was the wholly new Winchester Palace, begun for Charles II by Wren with the assistance of Hawksmoor. And as we can see here, it was intended as a grand forecourt palace. But the work was abandoned after the king's death in 1685, before the projected dome was ever built. And subsequently, the building was converted into a prison and then a barracks before being destroyed by fire in 1894. Now, one of the largest building projects in England at the end of the 17th century was the conversion of Greenwich Palace into the Royal Naval Hospital. And Wren's earliest scheme, dated around 1694, included a central range topped by a single dome. But this scheme was revised, and Greenwich never became a grand forecourt palace in the sense of a three-sided enclosure, as Wren imagined in that topped image you see of the screen. Instead, it materialized as a variation on this theme, with two sets of parallel blocks stretching north to the Thames, but left open at the southern end in order to preserve the vista from the Queen's House, which dated from earlier in the century. And that is how you see Greenwich if you visit today. So this idea of a forecourt palace with projecting wings or advancing forebuildings was what appealed most to Carlisle as he cast about for the shape, size, and form of his intended palace. But in addition to this, the possibility of producing a house with a huge domed central block is really what catapulted Castle Howard into the realm of the extraordinary. And Carlisle's house can reasonably lay claim to be the first private dwelling in England to be built with a large masonry lantern and dome. And it was, as we've seen, during the course of about 1700 that Vanbrugh, with Hawksmoor and Carlisle, settled upon this design featuring the grand crowning dome. And there are two likely sources for this feature on the house. The first is the various kinds of timber-built wooden lanterns or cupolas that adorned numerous 17th century houses, such as Coles Hill, Berkshire, begun in 1659 at the bottom of your screen, or Clarendon House, Piccadilly, dating from the 1660s, both built by the architect Sir Roger Pratt. And these delightful little wooden cupolas graced a good number of houses in the 17th century. If you look at those and then go to the Castle Howard Dome, you realize the Castle Howard Dome is almost something that was on steroids compared to these rather modest structures. Now, the other influence for the Castle Howard Dome was from the continent. And these two examples have been cited for Castle Howard. The Elector's Palace in Mannheim by Jean Marot around 1670, with not only a central dome, but also quadrants and arcades connecting the main block with projecting wings. And in Paris, the Collège de Quatre Nations, begun by Louis Le Vau in the 1660s, which displays a similar combination of features. And there were important examples in England. We've seen how Winchester and Greenwich were intended to have crowning domes on a central block, albeit both unexecuted. And there can be little doubt that between 1699 and 1701, and afterwards as building work in Yorkshire progressed, Carlisle and his two architects would have discussed the designs for his mansion on various occasions. And at the same time, they were all fully aware of the great dome building projects in London, at Greenwich, and also, of course, at St. Paul's Cathedral, where the designs for the dome were only finalized between 1704 and 1706. So the idea for the dome at Castle Howard reached Yorkshire via Greenwich and other sources through the offices of Hawksmoor and Vanbrugh, who were both involved in those projects in the capital. It's almost as though, talking about this to Carlisle, he will have turned to his two men and said, "I'll have one of those on my new building, thank you." So although we never know the exact story behind the decision to build a dome at Castle Howard, it is inaccurate to speak of it as simply Vanbragh's masterstroke. The informal and essentially collaborative venture between these two architects and their patron doesn't have to admit one man's genius at the expense of the others. But behind this successful triumvirate, there lies another figure who cannot be entirely forgotten, and that's Talman himself. By the time of this proposal in this garden plan, Talman's star had waned. Not only had he fallen foul of his patron and been supplanted by Vanbrugh, but the design itself was inadequate, which is hardly surprising, given its clunky, angular nature, showing two mismatched projecting wings. And this design is very odd indeed, precisely because it's so crude. After all, we know that he was quite capable of designing stylish and sophisticated buildings. His designs for the Duke of Newcastle, for example, included suggestions for French-inspired domes, and he was perfectly capable of employing the forecourt formula in a much more elegant manner. So, for example, in 1683, Talman designed Hackwood in Hampshire for the Marquis of Winchester. And you look at the floor plan on the right, and you can see how this building begins to foreshadow the shape of Castle Howard in connecting its wings to the main block. And in 1695, Talman is said to have been responsible for the wooden model on the right-hand side of your screen for the great palace of De Vorst in the Netherlands, built for the Earl of Albemarle. So these examples raise the possibility that directly or indirectly, Castle Howard's singular shape owes something to Talman. And the connection to De Vorst also opens up intriguing relations to Dutch influences on English architecture. And we shouldn't forget that William III brought his own architect, Jacob Roman, to England with him in the 1690s. So the presence of Talman raises the question that perhaps the thinking behind the quadrants at Castle Howard should be credited to him, and also that the reorientation of the house was his responsibility too. Now, we know Castle Howard today sitting as it does on a ridge along the ridge line facing north-south, as we see in the top picture. But the early proposals for the house cited it on an east-west axis like the old medieval castle of Henderskelf. But look at the bottom image of this screen and you'll see on the left-hand side how the land falls away sharply to the north. So for any house sitting on an east-west axis would require enormous earthworks to accommodate an extended frontage on falling away ground. So this 90-degree swivel from east to west, from east-west to north-south, is of huge importance, and it can be traced through these two early garden designs submitted to Carlisle by George London, who was the leading nurseryman and gardener of the day and a regular partner of William Talman. So these two garden plans show, first of all, on the left-hand side, a Talman house, and second, on the right-hand side, a Vanbrugh house, by which time you can see that the building has been repositioned to face north-south. And this move has always been seen as Vanbragh's. But can we be quite so certain of that? There is evidence to suggest that Talman was thinking about quadrants and courtyards for Carlisle before his dismissal. And this sketchy little drawing, apparently for a house for Carlisle, his name written, as you can see, sideways on the center of the drawing. If you look at the little sketch on the left-hand side, it's apparently showing a palace with some of these attributes: quadrants, projecting wings, and a forecourt. So is it possible that both house plans in these garden proposals are in fact by Talman? That familiar shape of the house in plan, rather crab-like with its projecting wings, as seen on that second garden proposal on the right, that's always been attributed to Vanbrugh, and it of course is repeated in the ground plans published in 1715. But let's just ask ourselves the question: how did Vanbrugh arrive at this shape in the first place? Castle Howard was his first house. So how did he come up with this sophisticated and original design? Now, we've looked at certain antecedents, both English and continental, but is it entirely beyond the bounds of possibility that this form of a house with side apartments and projecting wings linked by quadrants was Talman's idea in the first place? It's a design that fits with much of his other work. So perhaps then, Vanbrugh picked up this Talman idea, together with Hawksmoor, refined the scheme into something that Carlisle accepted. Now, this is potentially very uncomfortable territory for someone who works at Castle Howard and who loves the building so much as I do. In effect, I'm accusing Vanbrugh of theft. Now, the issue of influence is notoriously hard, if not impossible, to prove. I think what I'm trying to say here that it's important not to forget Talman in the design evolution of Castle Howard. And I think this question reminds us how architects borrow, copy, adapt, and even appropriate other designs. Now, at the moment Carlisle planned his great palace, his political career promised much. He saw Castle Howard as an important regional base from which he could exercise power and influence locally and nationally. And in this respect, Castle Howard was always intended to be more than just a private country seat. Well, so much for theory. What about practice? This great Baroque project materialized in one sense in that Castle Howard was built by Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor, but its existence as an active center of power was another matter. Carlisle's bright star crashed to earth prematurely. The death of William III in 1702 effectively marked the end of his public career, and within 2 months of the start of her reign, Queen Anne dismissed Carlisle from office. At the same time, his marriage foundered, and so the public and private rationale for this great palace vanished. And by 1715, with his house 3/4 completed, Carlisle switched his attention to fashioning the landscape. So then, when the great bird's eye view in Vitruvius Britannicus appeared in 1725, the representation of the house remained hypothetical. It did not yet boast matching wings. The wing on the right-hand side and the blocks beyond on the west of this complex had not been built. Looking at this image, you might have thought it would have spurred Carlisle into completing the building, but it didn't, notwithstanding Vanbrugh's pleas for construction on the west wing to begin. And nor did this stop Carlisle's completed house appearing in the background to his portrait by the artist William Aikman in 1728, revealed as he lowers his coronet in a dramatic flourish to expose the building behind. But as you can see, it is viewed here as a completed Castle Howard, which the building was not at this stage. And so the bird's eye view remained an idealized one, when in fact a dramatic discrepancy existed between appearance and reality. Carlisle's palace remained 3/4 finished and lopsided in appearance, something that we have been able to do thanks to the wonders of Photoshop today. And it's amazing how many times I can put this image on screen and people do a double take for it, thinking to themselves, why have I missed the West Wing that I'm so familiar with? And of course, we have to wait until the 1750s until Sir Thomas Robinson builds that wing a generation later in a Palladian style. And so finally, I think we have to ask whether Castle Howard was a failure. That great vision seen in the engravings never materialized fully. And purists who view the asymmetrical wings today might agree. But that view takes no account of the collisions between theory and practice that so often occur with building projects, especially when they stretch across decades with different personalities and changing fashions. And from 1715 onwards, Carlisle and his architects became more and more absorbed in fashioning the Castle Howard landscape, filling it with obelisks, temples, pyramids, and a mausoleum, a landscape as visionary and breathtaking as the house itself. And this spectrum of buildings outdoors constitutes as great an achievement as Carlisle's palace itself, if not something greater, especially when one appreciates the complementary nature of the house and the designed landscape, the subject of my talks later in May. But of one thing we can be certain. When he sat down at the end of his life in 1737 to calculate the entire outlay of his building projects, some £78,000, Carlisle will surely have viewed these accomplishments with great satisfaction. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Chris, for that fantastic, if slightly heretical presentation. Before we get to your questions, everybody, I have some upcoming programs that I would like to mention. On April 1st, I will be giving an online lecture that highlights the 2015 trip that we took for NEHGS to the Scottish borders, great houses and gardens of the Scottish borders. And then, speaking of Scotland, on April 10th, here in person in Boston, we will have the CEO of the National Trust for Scotland providing a wonderful lecture called The Love of Scotland, Artistic Fascination with Scotland's Landscape. And then on April 29th, I'll be hosting the wonderful Carl Raymond, who will be giving a lecture called Gilded Tables, The Art of Food and Dining in Edith Wharton's New York. And of course, you heard Chris just refer to the wonderful class he's going to be teaching for us, a two-part class on May 24th and May 31st on the gardens and landscapes of Castle Howard. We will have all of those up on our website very soon. The first three that I mentioned, you can register for now, and we hope to have the garden ones up in the next few weeks. Now, let's go ahead and answer your questions. Type them into the question panel, and we will answer as many of them as we can in the time provided. And we already have a lot of questions, Chris. I'm going to start off by giving a plug. This is not a question. This is actually me observing things for our wonderful Castle Hill, which is owned by the, I love to say this, the oldest historic preservation organization in the world, the Trustees of Reservations here in Massachusetts. Castle Hill is in Ipswich, and it has, amazingly enough, two pieces of things that you talked about. We have parts of the dining room carved by Gridlin Gibbons in Castle Hill that was originally at Castleberry. And we also have a copy of the wonderful Coles Hill cupola that's on the top of Castle Hill. So this is just sort of a plea to get Christopher to come and visit us in Boston. The one question I have to say that comes up over and over again is, where did the money come from, Chris, to build this amazing house?
Well, it's, yeah, if I had $1 for every time I'd been asked that question, I'd never have to work a day for the rest of my life. Yeah, it's an important question. Where did it come from? They're an old landed family, and obviously land was the source of wealth. In the early 18th century, the Howard lands in the north of England will have been totaling over 100,000 acres. And that would have been in Cumbria, Yorkshire, Northumberland. So land obviously is the great source of money. for Carlisle too, government office to some extent. And then rather extraordinarily, Charles Saunders Smith, who wrote a book on the building of Castle Had a few years ago, he discovered that for a while, Carlisle was a successful gambler, but more importantly, he was a judicious gambler. So that when he was ahead at the table, he did what everybody should do, but few people do. He quit and traveled north with his winnings to finance the next burst of building. And this happened for a little period. So the money comes from a variety of sources. As I say, principally land, and there's a sense in which money always begets more money. If you roll that forward, of course, the dependence upon land becomes a problem from the late 19th century onwards with the agricultural depression and so on. One thing that the Howards never had is an urban portfolio. So they did not have conveniently a few acres in London, or even better still, a few acres in Manhattan, and nor did they have any colonial money. So they were not involved in the transatlantic trade in any way. So their money really relies on land. And to some extent, that's still true today. For a large estate of 9,000 acres, it's pretty unusual that we are supported pretty much entirely by land, i.e. farming, essentially, and tourism.
Wow, that is one hell of a comprehensive answer. I should also mention, for those of us who live in America, that when you said from his offices, it's important to remember that in the 18th century, when you were a government minister, you were expected to skim money off the top to enrich yourself, because the salaries were quite small, and some were more successful at that than others. I'm looking, there's so many wonderful questions here. Why did he experience a downfall with Queen Anne? I assume that's a Whig Tory thing, but you can enlighten us.
It's essentially a Whig Tory thing. So you would have different political administrations coming in today. There's a clear out of the old guard and in with the new guard. And so that's really why his political career stutters to a halt at that point.
And here's a question that's coming up more and more in these days. Was the slave trade a source of income for the family?
No, not at all. As I say, they were not involved in the transatlantic trade in any way whatsoever. They had no colonies, no holdings, plantations in North America or in the Caribbean, unlike a good number of families. In fact, the interesting thing with the Howard family, and I think I mentioned this, Curt, when I spoke to you in Boston a few years ago, is that come the 19th century, the family are vocal abolitionists. So they sit the other side of the fence.
Lovely to be able to hear that. I have to say, I have a question here about Sir Thomas Robinson, and I have to say, before I ask the question, that I want to put my cards on the table. I'm a big fan of symmetry, and I've read quite a bit about Sir Thomas, and he was a first-class ass. But the question is there any way to know why he did not make even a small gesture toward mirroring the quadrant in the forecourt when the West Wing was designed?
No, I mean, there are two things that happened, and I'll touch on it briefly in my next lecture. The first thing is that he started to demolish the western end of the southern range, which included a spectacular bow window by Hawksmoor, so that he could then anchor his projecting wing forward, and he just simply, the quadrant was never going to come into the equation. I think the other thing we have to think about Robinson is there is evidence from a garden plan in the 1750s that, having finished the house, which had been originally built from east to west, along comes Robinson, finishes the west wing. There's evidence that he would have liked to have moved backwards in an easterly direction, remodeling Vanbrugh and Hawksmoor's house.
Of course.
And that never happens. And the interesting thing is that the fourth Earl of Carlisle, who commissioned Robinson, Robinson was, after all, at that stage, his brother-in-law, is on record as bitterly regretting his choice of architect for the West Wing.
We should also mention that Sir Thomas was not a professional architect. He was an amateur gentleman architect who thought very highly of his skills. Had any of the three actually been to Versailles? I know that you mentioned that Lord Carlisle himself had not been. Do we know if Hawksmoor or Van Brugh? Certainly Van Brugh was in France.
Vanbrugh was when he was captured off the coast of France, and he was briefly imprisoned in Paris in the Bastille. He wasn't kind of there in chains. He was there on sort of on license. So the question we don't know the answer to is he clearly had the kind of freedom to roam a bit around Paris. Did he make it out to Versailles? We don't know. It's very difficult to say. Hawksmoor never left England. But what you have to remember is at that stage, the country is, is flooded with drawings from people who would have traveled to continental sites, France and Italy particularly, and engravings as well. So there's a big kind of library of representations of these buildings that would be easily available. Remember when Wren went to Europe, he promised to bring back all the architecture of Europe on paper.
I'm going to combine two questions in one here. One, what kind of stone was the house built of? And are the floors timbers, which is to say, could they support that heavy weight if they were timber floors of all that stonework?
Okay, so the building of the house is really, it's calcareous limestone, but it's on that sort of cusp between limestone and sandstone. So quite a lot of this stonework is porous, easily absorbs moisture. So that's clearly, for us today, that's a conservation issue that we have to face. I mean, the legacy of that sort of 18th century building. In terms of the floors, the building is basically stone floors. But one of the things, and Curt, you will know this from when you visited, that one of the extraordinary kind of divisions in Castle Howard is that you move between big public spaces and thoroughfares like corridors and halls with marble floors and stone walls to more intimate staterooms or bedrooms that have floorboards laid on those stone walls and stone floors, and they may have paper or textile hangings on the walls. So there's a real kind of binary feel to the house as you move through it.
Yes, I quite agree. And then for those of you who haven't been, this is possibly the most famous, I hesitate to say the most important, but certainly one of the most important houses in England. We've had a number of questions asking why it was named Castle Howard. Obviously, the family's last name was Howard, but Catherine specifically says, why was it not called a park or a place or a house? And I assume the word castle is meant to be romantic.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so let's remember, he builds his new house on the site of an old medieval castle, Henderskelf Castle. At no point does he seem to kind of want to call it the new Henderskelf Castle. Very briefly around 1701, 1702, there are references to the new castle. But around 1705, 1706, it starts to be called Castle Howard. The first question a lot of people say is, well, why isn't it called Howard Castle? And the answer to this, I think, lies with that playfulness that you get with Vanbrugh. Remember was a man of the theatre. He liked this idea of kind of drama and the mock fortifications that he creates in the grounds. And he talks about very proudly later in his life about creating the castle air at Castle Howard. And of course, Castle Howard is not a fortified building in any sense. If you want to take it, you just need to walk across the back lawn and it's yours for, forever as a conquest. It's not like now, the kind of crenellated fortified building. So there's a playfulness in this here going on. And therefore, the castle bit is more important than, say, calling it park or place or something like that.
Do you think Van Brugh actually had a name, had a part in naming the house?
Difficult to say. I mean, he and Carlisle were very close. I mean, Carlisle was godfather to one of his children. To my mind, again, you can never prove this. They clearly had a congenial friendship, and I'm sure in the same ways they'll have played around with designs and ideas, they'll have probably played around with the names. But I think the castle theatre, I think, is the sort of the conceit and if you like, the joke. The Howard bit obviously is kind of cementing the family identity on this specific location.
Lovely, thank you. The dome, we have Judy who says that the dome reminds her of Charlottenburg Palace in Berlin, which I think was built just about the same time as Castle Howard was going up. Is it possible that one of them influenced the other?
Difficult to say. I don't know enough about how kind of widespread images or representations of Charlottenburg were in England at that time. But what really intrigues me about that question is another kind of affinity between the two domes, not one that you'd have had in mind when asking the question in terms of the origin of the Castle Howard dome. But the Castle Howard dome is lost in the fire of 1940, it collapses into the hall. And so Castle Howard exists for a few years without its dome. That's 1940. A few years later, in Berlin, the Charlottenburg loses its dome. Both buildings have their domes reconstructed after the war, in the 1960s for Castle Howard. And both buildings and both owners have this problem about how to redecorate the underside of the dome. Castle Howard, there's a bold decision to try and recreate the original painted design by Antonio Pellegrini from a single black and white photograph. At the Charlottenburg, the underside is kind of more of a sort of wispy, cloudy sky as a kind of compromise. So I think there's a much more interesting parallel between those two in terms of later history and later recreation.
Interesting. And this also reminds me of, I believe that at Potsdam, Sanssouci, that Frederick the Great built, is it called New Palace, that was supposedly modeled on Castle Howard. Is that correct?
Do you know, Curt, that's the first I've heard of that. So you're going to send me away scurrying to look up things tonight.
Was Talman aware, this is a question from Carol, that Castle Howard, as it was finished, incorporated his designs, or did he live long enough to see what was actually built?
Talman will have lived long enough to see it appear in those engravings in 1715. To what extent he'll have sat there and fumed at the thought that this upstart has pinched my kind of original idea, it's difficult to say, because let's put it another way. We haven't got in the archives, a lawsuit lodged by Talman against Carlisle or Vanbrugh for misappropriating his ideas. Let's face it, all designers, architects, whatever, it's a world where you're plucking all sorts of things, and influence is so hard to tie down. I'm sure if it had gone to court, it would never have stood up, because there are other ways in which you can see the evolution of it coming. So I'm coming back to the point. I just want to kind of put him back into that design process. Think also about how architects are always, like magpies in the structural world.
Absolutely. And I would think that Talman, being the litigious man he was, if he could have, he probably would have sued. To Bonnie, who asked if there are descendants, the answer is yes. It's still owned by the Howard family today, and they still live in the house. The other question, which I think I know the answer to, but I'm going to spit it right toward you. Are these Howards related to the Howards of Anne Boleyn's time?
Yeah. Okay. So the unbroken family occupation since the third Earl built Castle Howard, with a brief hiatus during the Second World War, when a girls' school the building was requisitioned for a girls' school. This branch of the Howard family are directly descended from the Tudor Howards, the then Dukes of Norfolk, and particularly the fourth Duke of Norfolk, who supplied Henry VIII with two of his wives, his nieces, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, who, as we all know, met a rather sticky end. And it's from him, various generations down, that you get to the branch of the Earls of Carlisle, the Castle Howard.
Of the other influences that you showed, and Ruth specifically mentioned Thoresby, are any of those that you show the drawings of still in existence today?
Thoresby is still in existence today. It's now, I think, something like a kind of hotel. It was a private home, but it's passed out of ownership. And obviously some of the other houses, Petworth, Durham Park, Chatsworth, they're all in family ownership or have some family connection. Petworth obviously is National Trust owned as well. So there's a sort of, as it were, an arrangement there with the Lord Egremont's family. So yes, most of these houses that I showed you are there, although Kyton is not, and Burley on the Hill in Rutland lives in a rather abbreviated form, having had some bits of it demolished.
And in a horribly self-serving statement, I will say that information is available on my website, thedicamillo.com, that will tell you the history of all these various houses. And I think I'm just looking, there's so many questions here, Chris. It's just wonderful. Since the recreation of the dome, has there been any fire prevention efforts put into making sure this does not happen again? And actually, maybe you could mention how this happened in the first place during the war.
Okay, well, the fire is the great kind of calamity. I mean, you might say the two most important dates in the history of Castlereagh are 1699, when it was begun, 1940. 9th of November, when it was nearly lost. It was basically a chimney fire that got out of control and a cascade of disasters. Telephone line went down. Somebody else thought somebody else had gone to ring for the fire alarm, but nobody had. And the water failed for the pumps and all sorts of things like that. So since then, I mean, and it destroyed 20 rooms, left parts of the house open to the skies, and we're still dealing with that today. I've been hosting local councillors and officials today at Castlereagh. I took them into the burnt out wing, so they travel from the kind of finished opulent interiors to a derelict shell still, and that's a kind of jaw-dropping experience. And Curt, you'll remember that when I've taken you from that kind of transition.
I was just going to say it's an amazing experience, because it is just a ruin. I mean, there are no floors, the stones have collapsed. It's not something that you can actually see very easily, unless you know Chris, which of course is something everybody should be making their way to have happen. I should also say to the people who've asked about the follies were designed by Van Brah and by Hawksmoor, particularly Hawksmoor with the mausoleum. Yeah. And we'll end with one last question. And I should say, for those of you who actually are interested in seeing more about those follies, you should tune into our class that Chris will be teaching in May on the gardens and grounds of Castle Howard. The last question we'll end with is, do you have a favorite room in this great house?
Okay. Before I answer that, Curt, I'm just going to finish the previous question just to assure that person that, yes, we do have fire prevention measures in the building today, absolutely necessary. And we're in the middle of an extremely expensive fire alarm upgrade. So yes, fingers crossed that's never going to happen to us again. Do I have a favorite room? Oh, wow. I mean, you're asking me this on a Friday. I could give you today's answer, might be different from tomorrow. But I think I'm going to say the Great Hall is one of the most extraordinary spaces in England. Now, I didn't show you the interior today. I'm sorry it's taken me an hour to talk to you about the first 10 years of Castle Howard. Touches the riches of that building. But the Great Hall is a magnificent space. And what I want to say is that having worked there for so long, if you think you know this building, think again. I can go around the corner, doesn't matter what time of day, time of year, what the weather is, and I can see something in a different light. So the Great Hall, the sun might come in a way I've never seen it come through the dome windows, and it's just breathtaking. So I think that would be where it is. And let me say, we'd love to welcome you all to the Great Hall, which is one of the nicest places to have a champagne reception.
Which you can, if you have the money, you can arrange for that. I should also say something that I think puts this in context, the whole building of this house, is that when it was finished, it was grander than anything that the King of England had at the time, which says a lot, considering it's really in the middle of nowhere in Yorkshire, with all due apology to those of you from Yorkshire. And with that, we will officially end, but I do want to give a huge round of applause to Chris. And for those of you who have said that you would like to see more of the interiors, we had a wonderful presentation that Chris did at Christmas time at Castle Howard, had interiors, but what I think this will really do is give us the impetus to have you back to do just an interiors one, because obviously we can't get enough of you and Castle Howard. Thank you all again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you soon on our future programs. Goodbye for now.